All right. So last year I had said I like to put something interesting in the bio because I don't like dry bios. But I think the problem with that is you have to keep one-upping yourself every year. And so it's going to snowball, I think. So several years from now, hopefully there won't be anything in my bio that's actually true. So this is tack, seal, or bond. This is pretty much similar to what Robert and I talked about at the construction conference early in the year. We kind of did a tag team thing then. I think our comedy combination was better than his and Andy's. You know, we had a lot better response to that. But since he already did that, I'm going to talk about this. And you know, they gave me the title of the presentation, the same one, Tack, Seal, or Bond. You make the call. And I probably shouldn't say it like a used car salesman because I don't need to. What I want to start out by saying is that these are all good applications. These are all good options. And that's why we put it this way is really, if you understand what you're using it for and you understand what the ins and outs of each method are, you can use any of these and get good results. So I'll just do it that way. So kind of the introduction is to say, really, traditionally, we haven't put a lot of thought into tack coats or bond coats or whatever you're going to call them. We have used tack coat, and traditionally we use commodity emulsions for that. We spray it down and we get some bond between the layers. But with our modern things that we have going on, particularly thin lift overlays and that sort of stuff, we realize that having a good bond between pavement layers is very important. And there have been some different processes and some products that have come along that really help us with that. And so that's what these are really about. And those are going to be things like non-tracking tack coat or trackless tack or whatever you want to call it. But it's a tack coat material, which can either be hot applied or cold applied, but that in addition to not getting tracked all over the project like the old emulsions would, also gives us a very good bond between pavement layers, and that's the benefit of those. The spray paver, which also makes tracking a non-issue because it goes right down between the lifts before any equipment can get on it. We've also had very good results with that. And then you have things like underseals, which is not new. We've used those for a long time, but you also can get a very good bond with an underseal, and you can deal with the problems of tracking asphalt around the project. So what we had talked about was the idea that with each of these applications, you're kind of putting different amounts of asphalt out there. And that's kind of important in a lot of cases. With your new tack coats and even your traditional tack coats, you're getting down at the low end on the left side of the scale there. When you go up to these bond coats like the spray paver and everything, there's a little more asphalt, so those rates are up a little bit higher. And then when you're doing a traditional underseal, you're getting even more asphalt. And that offers some benefits and advantages. And so here's what the materials are. I'm getting ahead of my slides. But those underseals are just typical surface treatments like we would normally use. Now, when you go and look at the thickness of that layer that's been applied, it's related to the amount of asphalt you put on there, obviously. And so when you're doing those tack coats, trackless tack and that sort of thing, you're getting very little material out there on the road. And that's not necessarily a bad thing for bonding. There's plenty of evidence out there to suggest that loading up with more of those trackless tack coat materials does not necessarily make a better bond. It takes a certain amount to do it. Adding more is not necessarily better. And then you get a little bit thicker layer when you go with the spray paver, although there's the suggestion that that material wicks up into the layer of hot mix that's going onto it and actually creates a bonded layer of asphalt and hot mix together. And we think that actually happens, and that's good. And then you're getting a really thick application when you do an underseal because you're throwing aggregate into it. And so the thickness of the aggregate is really defining the thickness of your application. And so that means something to you as well. What is that asphalt really doing for you in a lot of cases? Well, sometimes when we use a seal coat, we're looking to waterproof. We're trying to keep water out of the pavement structure. And obviously, the more asphalt you can get out there and the thicker layer of application, the better job you can do of that. And so if you're concerned about sealing, well, that may mean that an underseal is a great option. And it may mean that a trackless tack coat or a non-tracking tack is not as good of an option because you're not going to get as good a seal when you go with those kind of materials. However, when you look at bond strength, what we've seen and the evidence so far is that those tack coat materials get superior bond strength, even though it's not as much asphalt. And then the spray paver also gets a very good bond strength. And then the worst one, but not a bad bond by any means, is the underseal, but it doesn't do as good a job. And so that means that when you start to consider what you're going to put on top of this and what the purpose of that bond layer is to you, that may influence your choice in what you're going to use. So let's see where this one's going. So when we go with the tack coat, we're usually talking about having good shape on the existing structure, maybe even a new lift of hot mix, and where tracking is an issue, where we really have either a public perception issue or something else that means that we're really worried about tracking asphalt into the rest of the project. It's a great option to use a trackless tack, non-tracking material, and if it's going to be a thin lift of asphalt on top of there and we really don't want any slippage, we need a good bond, that's a great way to go. Thin lifts are also good with the spray paver, and we've actually got a spec for that now that's going into the new spec book for these spray paver applications. We get a terrific bond between those layers, and that's worked very well with that. And we're losing a lot of these thin PFCs, Tom mixes, that sort of thing. So the spray paver works really well for that stuff. And then when we need a good seal, because maybe we have an old surface that has some cracking in it and that sort of thing, we may want to mitigate that cracking or simply keep the water out of those cracks, then we may want to go with an underseal, because that gets a lot more asphalt on the road to get a better seal. And particularly if there's a thick layer of asphalt going on top of there, one, you don't need near as strong of a bond for that because that asphalt's less likely to move around, and it's more tolerant of that texture that you're going to get from that seal that you put on the surface. So to talk about each one in general, when we talk about our tack coat materials, our new tack coat materials, there's hot applied and cold applied. So the hot applied, until very recently, there was one product that we had used for that, and it's called Ultrafuse. And we've used it on trial work, we've used it on some bigger projects. We've gotten great results with that. Fantastic product, gives us a superior bond. You spray it on the ground, and within a minute, you can go walk around on it, drive equipment on it. The guys who sell it like to roll around in it and with their orange vest on to show that it doesn't stick to anything, but it reactivates when you put the mix on it. This stuff has worked great for us. If we haven't used it extremely extensively, it's probably because it's been a little bit more expensive. It's a very, very polymer modified material. Premium performance comes at a premium price in this case. However, just very recently, there's at least one more product that's come out that we're trying out that may be a competitor to this. So this may become much more available in the future because there may be more products out there. Emulsified, there's a whole bunch of them. So you've got the original material that we first looked at called trackless tack. You've got E-Tack. You've got a couple of other products that are out there by different emulsion manufacturers, all intended to accomplish the same purpose. These have also given us great performance. And the tracking, how well they prevent tracking varies from product to product. Some of them are called trackless tack because they feel like within 30 minutes you won't track it at all. Some of them say, well, that's not really ever going to be true, and so it's less tracking tack. And there have even been some that have been proposed that are just supposed to be good bonding materials, but that are not necessarily intended to be low tracking tack. So there's a bunch of different products out there that perform in different ways. But because they're all emulsions, because they are typically not really esoteric materials or highly polymer modified, they're competitively priced, and in fact, they're priced close to what other commodity emulsions might be for the most part. So these are very available and work really well for us. Biggest problem is there's no consistent approach to what type of material properties you're going to expect from that. And so this is a table I had when we looked at the different materials we have out there. And so the highlighted rows there are just showing you that even when you look at things as basic as the amount of asphalt in the product, that varies a lot. And when you look at things like the penetration of the residue and even the application rate, it varies a lot from product to product. And one thing I want to point out to you is that these properties in there are not properties that we picked for the material because we thought those were important to its performance. These are just the properties that the material manufacturer told us their product met, and we have to have a spec so we can get out there and try the product out and use it, but these are not based on whether or not it's a good tack coat. These are just based on whatever we can do to get something out there and get a spec and get it in a contract. So the key is, and if you like to play pool like I do, and you know that when you play pool and you've got a difficult shot, well, you take your time. You go look at it every way, you line it up, you see what all the angles are and everything, then you carefully take the shot. And they call that poking. If you don't do that, if you just run up there and hit it, they call that poke and hope, right? Well, I was thinking about that in terms of this. Well, you don't want to spray and pray with your tack coats because these materials are very different from each other. They're applied differently, they're used at different application rates, and so you want to pay attention. You want to make sure you know which material you're getting. There's a lot of different things out there. You want to listen to the vendor because when they say, this is the application rate I recommend, well, they kind of know what they need, and it may be very different from our traditional commodity emulsions that we've used, and in fact, almost all of them are lower rate than that. And if you shoot it at too high rate, it skins over, it tracks all over the place. You get a bad project, the manufacturer gets a black eye, and nobody's happy. So don't do that. Make sure you do your homework, make sure you know what you're getting, make sure you talk to your manufacturer, and then you'll get a good application with these materials. Go to the spray paver. I talked a little more about this last year when I talked about tack coat, but essentially there's your schematic of the spray paver. The red is the mix going down, but ahead of the mix, coming out the back of the paver, is a distributor that's spraying down that bond coat. And so that all happens at once, and it's very smooth. Tracking becomes unimportant because you're never going to drive anything on that emulsion that you sprayed down for that bond coat. You're going to put mix right on top of it. Works really well. Problems we've had with that, well, probably one of the biggest difficulties is that your contractor has to have a spray paver, and it's an expensive piece of equipment, and so it does depend a little bit on availability. But you also want to make sure you've got a really good, consistent process, and that means you want a good, even distribution. It's a lot harder to verify the distribution rate when it's coming out and having mix go right down on top of it compared to a seal coat where you can actually see all of the nozzles. And you want to make sure that, somehow you observe that and try to make sure you're getting good braking on your emulsion, which is really just a quality control issue for the emulsion as much as anything else. And you want to make sure you have a good continuous operation, not start and stop. You avoid getting fat spots. You avoid having equipment sitting on top of that. You avoid drips from that distributor and that sort of thing. And keep the lane out front very clean because anything you get on there, usually these are with very thin mixes, and so if you have any irregularities out there in the lane in front, it's going to cause you problems. And then underseal is the last one. Nothing fancy about an underseal. It's just a seal coat that goes underneath a hot mix. Good things about it are that everybody's familiar with that application, and most contractors can do it. The best practices for doing underseals are pretty familiar to everybody. Lots of choices for materials. We can use asphalts, emulsions, we can use asphalt rubber. Asphalt rubber is a good option if we're trying to really mitigate cracking, and sometimes in other states they do something similar to that and call it a SAMI. We can do things like that, and we get a good seal, as I mentioned. Also, if you're going to put down this underseal, but you're not going to come back quickly with mix, and you're going to have equipment driving on that bond layer for an extended period of time, this is a great application because the aggregate does just what it does in a seal coat and keeps the tires out of the asphalt. So, just to sum it up, tack, seal, or bond. You need to consider what you're going to put on top of it. You need to consider what you're putting it on top of, and make sure that those are compatible with each other and that your bond coat is compatible with that. How long are you going to have traffic running on it? What is the availability of the equipment, the skill level or the comfort level of the contractor with the application, and what does the manufacturer recommend that you do with that? And so these are all things that you have to consider. But again, all of these are very good options. So once more, you make the call. Oh, and this is this picture that Robert had at the end of our last presentation. And that truck on the bottom, we're looking at that, and it says, the sign on it says that it's like a magnetic nail picker. And we're like, wow, that's kind of weird, you know, why is that on that construction project? And looking into that, I think I figured that out, is before somebody invented Tack Coat, we actually had to nail the layers of hot mix together. So that's why that's out there. Anybody remember that?